So, relations among the time and frequency domain representations. So, we discussed quite a bit when we were doing root locus design how the time response characteristics were related to things like the pole location and where you were in the S-plane and all that. And we don't have, we haven't yet really discussed, besides stability, and stability is the only performance characteristic that we've considered so far. So most of the time when you design a control system, stability is, of course, paramount. You got to be stable. But after that, you want it to not be shitty. So that's the other aspect. So you've got to be able to at least change your gain and then potentially use different controllers, not just gain control, but other types of control as well. And the response characteristics that you care about are time domain characteristics if it's, well, they're always time domain, because really at the end of the day, you care about what happens in the time domain. Of course, if you think of it in terms of filtering, you do care about the frequency domain, but that's maybe not a common way of using a controller, although we can use a controller as a filter if we want to. So let's go ahead and discuss some relationships between these frequency domain techniques, the Boda and the Nyquist stuff that we've been doing, gain margin, phase margin, and all that, and relate that back to some time domain stuff like natural frequency, damping ratio, that type of thing. So, okay, the second order assumption is the first thing. So, as in root locus design, most of our transient response characteristics, such as percent overshoot, settling time, and peak time, are based on the assumption that the closed loop system is second order. So those response characteristics are not just defined for second order systems, but they're analytic expressions that we come up with for percent overshoot, for settling time, and for peak time and rise time as well. They are all couched in terms of second order systems. But this is rarely actually the case, as we know, but often gets us close enough that small iterations on the initial design can achieve the desired transient response. So then, like, we get close using some design rules, and then we can iterate using simulation. It's funny because I was lecturing today about this stuff in terms of root locus for the system dynamics folks, and the time response characteristics that we care about are not analytically found with these simple expressions that we have explicitly. But they do usually get us in the ballpark enough that we can iterate using simulation at the end. And that's, I would say, my recommended way of going about doing controller design. Another way to go is just simulation, right? So there is an argument to be made that the simulation tools are getting good enough and fast enough that we don't really need to have all these design rules for things. We could just simulate stuff and look for performance improvements and start searching that space. And you can set up a self-tuning algorithm that tunes stuff. You don't have to actually do all of these analytic predictions beforehand. I still think that having the intuition to be able to construct a controller design analytically is important, and so that's why we still teach it. But there are some folks who are going way hardcore simulation people who are just saying, like, you know, we have the simulation tools, why not just go all simulation in your design, controller design? And I get it. I have some respect for that position. I still hold on to these maybe old-fashioned now analytic design methods. Although relying heavily on simulation, doing some analytic work, then simulating and tweaking. I think that's really the best of both worlds. But I don't know. Others could disagree with me. It's like, for instance, those nice things you do in MATLAB where you can like move around the poles and the zeros just like manually in the S-plane, and you could see the transients happening. And you can have it like compute things like the settling time like on the fly as you move stuff around. I mean, that's amazing. And I could see the argument that that's all we really need to do is just, stick stuff in there and get the transient responses we want and then just walk away. I do think in some cases, at least, that's not going to totally work for you, and you won't get the intuition on it, which I think is important somehow.
Does it work in a non-causal system too?
No, doesn't. Nothing in MATLAB works in a non-causal system, but maybe Simulink, that was brought up. Maybe Simulink does. I gotta find that out. I almost wrote my own solver, and then I was like, whoa. I need to take a step back. Maybe I don't really need to do this right now. I was like about to embark on this probably like 6-month amount of work. Yeah, and then I was like, no, this is a bad idea. I'll just throw some poles out there and try it. I actually thought, I was like, maybe I could just like, we have too many zeros. Maybe I could just like take out some zeros, or like started to like look at it. But then I was like, no, I think I could screw up the response easier by throwing out zeros than adding poles way out to the left. So we'll see. All right. Good. The second order approximation assumes an open loop transfer function of this form, which yields a closed loop transfer function of this form, okay, which has a familiar frequency response, okay. We've spent a lot of time with 7.20. Now I'm going to define a quantity that's another quantity that's talked about a lot in control systems, but it's also used in many other contexts, and that is bandwidth. So bandwidth is something that's talked about in informal settings and formal settings, but it usually has some reference to the spectrum, and it defines some region of usually like a pass band, or a region where input signals will pass through and other signals will not. And we're going to use bandwidth as a parameter that is a bridge between the frequency response representation and the time domain representation. But it is generally just a useful concept of bandwidth. So we define it here. So let a system have transfer function g of s and frequency response function g of j omega. The bandwidth, omega bw, of the system is the angular frequency at which the magnitude of the frequency response function is 3 dB less than the magnitude at zero frequency, the DC magnitude. Okay? So that's the definition of the bandwidth. And it turns out that for second order systems of the form 7.20, you can easily relate quantities that are time domain quantities to the bandwidth. So that's why we're using it in this context. I've got almost all my font issues fixed, but there are a few characters that are just not coming in. And they're like, I think they're all parentheses.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, it's the big parentheses. Is this a parenthesis too? Is that, or is that something else? This is definitely one, and this is one. So what is this? Is that just some random character that just got thrown in there?
That's parentheses right after.
This is?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There you go, they match. Yeah, I don't get it. It has the font, but it just some characters it doesn't like. It's the big parentheses it doesn't like. So I'm not going through the derivation here, but it is straightforward to show that the bandwidth of the second order closed loop transfer function is 7.20 is related to its natural frequency omega n and the damping ratio zeta by this expression. Okay. And the reason, so I mean that's useful in and of itself, the natural frequency and damping ratio relationship. But the real reason that we're doing this is to go one step further, because we've already in the past related for the second order system the natural frequency damping ratio to the transient response characteristics like rise time, settling time, and percent overshoot, all that stuff. So that's why we're using zeta and omega n as a bridge here. So if a system behaves approximately like this second order system, equation 7.21 relates the closed loop frequency response characteristic, omega bw, the bandwidth, and the closed loop time response characteristic, omega n and zeta. This is a big step, but we often design the speed of response in terms of settling time, Ts, peak time, Tp, and rise time, Tr. We already have relationships for these quantities and omega n and zeta. So the consequences of two of which, when applied to equation 7.21, are shown below. So essentially, we are sticking in our relationships between omega n and zeta and settling time and peak time in these two formulas. So there. All right. So the bandwidth is related to the settling time mixed with the damping ratio. And it's also related to the peak time mixed with the damping ratio. Okay? Furthermore, it can be shown that when it exists, which it does for zeta between 0 and 1 over root 2, the peak magnitude, MP, which is the max magnitude of the frequency response function, is 1 over 2 zeta times root 1 minus zeta squared. And that is another useful relationship between the Bode plot, or it could also be the Nyquist plot. You could also see a maximum there. And a time domain response, and that is zeta. Zeta is actually particularly good because zeta is directly related to the percent overshoot, right? So these two expressions tell you how to go from percent overshoot to zeta and from zeta to percent overshoot. And so if we have MP related to zeta, we also have MP related to percent overshoot. If you just plug in zeta equals this into MP, which isn't very pretty, but it's a direct relationship. And so you can think about the percent overshoot as being directly related to the magnitude of that peak in your second order magnitude response curve. That second order magnitude response curve starts out at 0 dB, right, for low frequency, and then it has itself a little peak here, and then it comes off rolls off at negative 40 dB per decade, right? Where this peak occurs near the natural frequency. And MP then is that height. So we can relate that height directly to the percent overshoot of the time domain response. This is frequency domain stuff, right? we relate that directly to the time domain response of the system, percent overshoot of the system. Remember, percent overshoot is the percentage amount of overshoot the system has when it responds to a step input overshooting the final value. So it's a time domain characteristic, but it's related to this frequency domain characteristic, which makes sense. I mean, they're going to be related somehow. I mean, if you do something in the frequency domain to it, it's going to affect the time domain. So it makes sense that there are relationships. Finding out what those are sometimes are more subtle. So, and here's another useful relationship here. So closed loop percent overshoot, which is something that we are often interested in, and damping ratio, which they come hand in hand, from the open loop phase margin. Now that is useful because looking at the open loop phase margin is pretty easy to do if you have Nyquist plot, Bode plot. And you can then back out the percent overshoot from that. And potentially you could design your gains appropriately, which we aren't going to get very into in this lecture, but we will next week. So, from closed loop considerations of the frequency response, we have learned to determine some closed loop time response characteristics. Now we learn to determine one of these characteristics, percent overshoot, from open loop frequency response. From the transfer function of equation 7.19 at second order one, it is straightforward to relate the phase margin, phi m, of the open loop transfer function to the damping ratio, zeta, via these expressions. So it goes both ways. You can solve it for the phase margin in terms of zeta, or zeta in terms of the phase margin. So we asked before, what is the phase margin's significance exactly? Well, one significance that it has is it's related directly to the open loop phase margin is related directly to the closed loop damping ratio, which is useful, especially because we can always go from damping ratio to percent overshoot. So percent overshoot is governed by the phase margin, and that's another useful sort of tool to have in our bag. So as we know from equation 7.24, percent overshoot is directly related to zeta, so phase margin can be directly related to percent overshoot, as shown in figure 7.8. So I just went ahead and plotted the two. It's not a very sexy expression if you work it out, but you can plot them. And you can see that low phase margins mean high percent overshoots, and high phase margins, which high is 60 degrees of phase margin. I should have a label here, degrees. 60 degrees of phase margin gives you a relatively small percent overshoot, right? So there's nothing quite as satisfying to an engineer as a nicely constructed design curve. So I like making design curves. So this relates the phase margin to the percent overshoot, which is useful. And this curve does the same for the damping ratio. So here's the phase margin again, and then here's the damping ratio. And so instead of percent overshoot, we're looking at damping ratio. Maybe we're thinking in terms of damping ratio, because that's a relatively intuitive quantity as well. Damping ratio is not that bad to work with. If you've got a damping ratio between 0 and 1, you know that you're in the under damped region, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How can you have a damping ratio greater than 1 and still... Oh, never mind. I was thinking about the peak magnitude.
Yeah.
About the peak magnitude, right?
Overshoot.
Yeah.
Because it'll go like this.
Never mind. I screwed it. I screwed that.
Yeah, it doesn't have an interpretation in terms of overshoot, but it does for zeta. So as you increase this phase margin, if you get to really large phase margins, your damping ratio, you're very over damped in those cases. So yeah. So it's kind of those are the two ways to think about the phase margin in terms of time responses that are more intuitive to us. Some of these other ones are not as intuitive. So yeah. Okay, so that was this. Good. So finally, closed loop settling and peak times from open loop frequency response. We introduced the concept of bandwidth and related the closed loop bandwidth, omega BW, to settling time, TS, and peak time, TP, in equation 7.22. There is a method, which we present but leave underived, that allows us to find the closed loop bandwidth of many systems from the open loop frequency response, allowing us to relate the open loop frequency response, TS and TP. Okay? To relate the open loop frequency response to the closed loop TS and TP. The method is based on the following insight. The closed loop bandwidth is approximately equal to the frequency at which the magnitude of the open loop frequency response is in the interval -6 to -7.5 dB, if the phase of the open loop frequency response is in the interval -135 to -225 degrees. This is not obvious. It's something that you just have to look at for a while. It's kind of subtle. In any case, it's roughly the case. And so this is what we're always doing, is we're looking for these sort of rules we can use to help us get to a design, which, since it's a design that it has a controller involved, we don't have to be perfect on it to have the performance be reasonable. Also, we can simulate and tweak. So this is another one of those situations. So this gives us a method to approximate closed loop settling and peak times by inspecting the open loop frequency response. So here's the method. And it's kind of like I'm just sort of giving it to you as an algorithm. To gain insight into why this is true, you have to sit down and unpack everything. There's a lot to unpack, though. So, step 1, estimate the closed loop bandwidth, omega BW, by finding the frequency at which the magnitude of the open loop frequency response is in the interval -6 to -7.5 dB. Okay? Verify that open loop phase at omega bandwidth is in the interval -135 to -225. This doesn't really apply if this isn't the case. So you have to check to make sure that that's the case. Then determine zeta via the phase margin. So use that equation or that figure. And then finally estimate TS and TP via equation 7.22. So that's the algorithm that gives it to you. It's really not, I don't like to give you guys things that don't have any intuition involved in them. It's just here you go, here's the recipe. But that design tool, I encourage you to dig into it and learn more about it, but we just didn't have time to go through the details of how to derive that. So it's useful, though, and it gives us another way to evaluate the time domain transient response characteristics in closed loop from open loop frequency domain stuff. Okay. And when we do design in terms of the frequency response, these will help us sort of light the way. The time domain stuff, analytically and intuitively, tend to be a little bit easier to work with. But you can do all the stuff that we've done in the time domain stuff in the frequency domain, pretty much. And I'm gonna sort of end it here for this week, but I have to decide. So last year, what I did was we were coming to the end like this, and I was like, okay, I'm going to show how to do frequency design, with just gain control and design for certain characteristics based on gain. Which is mostly what we've done so far, but you also, of course, can do shaping based on putting in lead, lag. All of that stuff is valid here too, and I want to get into that too. There's another topic that I would like to cover as well, and that is state space controller design. So I think we're going to have time to do both of them this year. So last year what I did was I said, okay, we're going to skip the rest of the frequency design stuff. Well, we did a little bit more than we did just today. And then we skipped to state space design because we didn't have time to do both. I think we're going to get to do both this year. Whether or not we're going to be able to do a lot of homework on the state space, I don't know. But I do think we should probably do some more frequency stuff because we've done a lot of work to lay the groundwork for doing frequency design. But it would be a shame to only do gain design, gain controllers. That's just like only getting to do root locus design, but just by using the gains and not being able to move the root locus around. Yeah.
Do you know how we're going to be tackling this stuff on the final? Since a lot of this is not really feasible to do by hand.
Yeah, so it is highly likely that your final is going to be at least partially take-home. I've done hybrid exams before, and they've gone pretty well, where we do some in the class and some of it take-home.
That's basically 2 finals.
Yeah, I
I mean, food for thought. We still have the homework. We still have to build a project, test the project.
yeah, no, I agree. I know. Yeah, and I am likely going to make it take home because there's really nothing. There's nothing that we do that we don't use some sort of code to help us with. So I'll probably make it a take-home exam. I don't think, like, I mean, like, the midterm exam I think was a challenging exam for you guys, but I also felt like it was in line with what the homework was. It was just another version of that. The design was a little bit more challenging, I think, in a couple aspects, but I could give you guys, at the end of this, I could give you guys like a frequency designed controller, frequency domain design controller. So using Nyquist and all of that to design a controller. And then I could also give you like a state space controller to design as well. And like I go through those like in very lengthy examples, and then you guys, I mean, I know that on the midterm, the part that took a lot of the time was to work out the algebra for those networks that you had to build, which was, not something we talked about in class a lot, so that's part of why it took so long. But the other stuff was kind of like go through the algorithm that we developed in class for how to design and then execute it, right? You just had to understand all the steps, which is a lot of work. I know. I'm not trying to say that's not a lot of work. It is a lot of work. but it's not something that I think when you come out of this class, you should be able to do that. You should be able to go through that process and do that design. And I think it's something that everyone will be capable of doing. So when you finish this class, you'll have done, I mean, it's not going to be like a big surprise on the final exam. It's going to be like a frequency response one, and it's going to be like a state space one, assuming we cover all of it. And then you'll have done root locus design of like PID controllers. You'll have done root locus design of like lag lead stuff. You'll have done frequency response controller design and state space controller design, which we won't get into like optimal control theory, but we'll have thoroughly covered all of classical control theory and then some, because the state space stuff is not typically in this domain of classical control theory. It's more of a modern control theory. So we're like just brushing some aspects of modern control theory in that last chapter. The one thing that we're not going to get a chance to do, I think, because we're a little bit behind, because the project's taking up a lot of our time in class, which is totally fine, is that we won't get to cover some digital control stuff. So I'm kind of throwing the digital control stuff out. I would love to get to it. It's really awesome, and I think you guys would like it. And one of the things that's really nice about it is it's very practical, because a lot of times we're going to actually implement these controllers in digital form. So the folks that are on the controller group for the project have to use some amount of digital control, some amount of thinking like that. There's a whole vast amount of theory that goes into it. I mean, I have a book that's this thick on my desk that's called Digital Control Theory. It's huge. Powell book, Franklin Powell, and maybe I think it's Franklin and Powell. But there's so much to it. But I mean, like, for instance, instead of having a differential equation to describe your system, you have a difference equation that describes your system. Instead of having a transfer function in the Laplace domain, you have a Laplace, you have a transfer function in the Z domain, which is, well, it's not impedance. It's this. It's the Z transform, which is a sort of digital or discrete version of the Laplace transform. But so you can represent, so like for a difference equation, it has a transfer function that is a Z transform, and for a differential equation, it has a transfer function that is a Laplace transform. So there are all these analogies, and like there's like stability changes. Instead of being the left half plane in the S plane, it's in the Z plane, and it's within the unit circle. Like all of a lot of stuff changes, but a lot of it is just just an analogy. And then there are a lot of implementation considerations and delay, and then how do you do like A to D conversion, D to A conversion? How do you model all this in MATLAB? Turns out MATLAB can do discrete transfer functions as well. Funny story, I actually did that with this problem. I thought maybe I can put it over into the discrete domain and see if I can simulate it in a discrete way, because it's actually a little bit easier to implement an algorithm discretely. But 3 of the methods to transform a transfer function from the continuous domain to the discrete domain, 3 of the 5 will not do a non-causal system, and the other 2 will give you one of them will give you a non-causal discrete one, which I could have maybe played with. The other one will give you a causal discrete one. Tustin's method will. but it's unstable. So I was like, okay, just can't win. Just can't win with the methods that we typically use. But I'm curious. I mean, there's another whole topic, feed-forward control. They do this kind of thing in there, though, so I want to explore that more. I haven't done a lot of that. So.
Also, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So in the class, since we're not going to get to the digital controls,
Yeah.
since we have notes on that, would it be possible to send it out?
Yeah, if I have some notes on it, I don't know if I do, but if I do, I'm happy to. Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah. I want to go searching around with some notes.
And I definitely have